They called Sudan Bilad al-Sudan, the land of the blacks. But the DNA says that name is only part of the story, because inside the people of Sudan lies a timeline that stretches from the dawn of humanity to the fall of ancient kingdoms, to migrations only 7 centuries ago. Archaeologists have dug deep into the Nile Valley, finding burials at Kerma dating back 4,500 years. Skulls shaped by Nubian ancestry, but jewellery and artefacts linked to Egypt and even the Levant. But when geneticists extracted DNA, the shock was immediate. The male lines told one story, the female lines another. On the paternal side, they found haplogroup A, the oldest Y chromosome lineage on Earth, tracing back almost 200,000 years. It survives in high frequency among Nilotic tribes like the Dinka and Nuer, whose ancestors watched the Sahara turn from green savanna to desert. But alongside it was something that didn't belong to that ancient world. Haplogroup J1, a lineage from the Arabian Peninsula, appearing in Sudanese men only after the 14th century. The very moment the Christian kingdom of Makuria fell, and Arab tribes flooded into the Nile Valley. This is where the contradiction begins. Oral histories in Sudan often speak of pure descent, purely Arab in the north, purely African in the south. But the genome refuses to play by those rules. In one body you might find the bloodline of an early Homo sapiens who walked the Upper Nile before the pyramids existed, and the signature of a trader from Yemen who crossed the Red Sea less than 30 generations ago. From space, the Nile looks like a living scar through the desert, a corridor that for tens of thousands of years carried armies, merchants and pilgrims, and with them new bloodlines. The stones at Kerma, the temples at Napata, the silent fortress walls of Dongola, all have stood witness to these crossings. But if these roots run so deep, how did strangers from across the sea find their way into the same blood? To answer that, we have to leave the comfort of written history and step into a time tens of thousands of years before the first pharaoh drew breath. You've heard the story, the Great Migration out of Africa. But what if I told you? That story is only half true, because some of those who left came back. And Sudan, the land between the Nile and the desert, was one of the first places to feel their return. Scientists call it ancient back migration, movements of people from Eurasia into Africa tens of thousands of years ago. The genetic trail is still inside living Sudanese. Hidden in their cells are markers like mtDNA M1, a maternal lineage that originated outside Africa and returned roughly 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, and yDNA R1b-588, a paternal line carried by men who likely crossed the Sahara around 7,000 years ago. This wasn't random. The land itself made it possible. During the African humid period, 12,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Sahara wasn't a desert. It was green. Rivers cut across it. Lakes filled basins that are now barren sand. One of the greatest of these lifelines was Wadi Hawa in northwestern Sudan. Today a dry riverbed, but back then a flowing artery connecting the Chad Basin to the Nile. Along its banks, herders, traders and entire communities moved, carrying not only goods, but genes. Imagine a caravan 6,000 years before the first pyramid moving east toward the Nile. They are strangers here. Their faces, their speech, their customs unfamiliar. Yet they settle, marry, and within a few generations their foreign blood is part of the Nile story. The DNA evidence is clear. These lineages aren't the product of Arab expansion or medieval trade. They are far older. And yet, even as some left Africa and returned, others never left at all. They stayed. They endured the droughts, the floods, the shifting sands of history, passing down unbroken African lineages that had been here since the very birth of our species. Those who stayed behind were about to create something remarkable, something the world had never seen before. But those who stayed behind built something the world had never seen. And here's the mind-bending twist. The very first chapter of Nile civilization did not begin in Egypt. It began here in Sudan. For over a century, textbooks crowned the Nile Delta as humanity's agricultural starting point in northeast Africa. But excavations near Khartoum and in the Middle Nile Valley have shattered that myth. The evidence is staggering. Pottery shards dated to 8,000 years ago, older than anything found in the Egyptian Nile Valley, decorated with dotted patterns, fired in ways that suggest generations of perfected craftsmanship. By 5000 BC, long before the first Egyptian pharaoh, Sudanese communities were not just surviving, they were thriving. Along the banks of the Nile, they cultivated sorghum, one of the world's earliest domesticated grains, and raised cattle whose bones show signs of selective breeding for size and milk yield. Fishing settlements left behind barbed bone harpoons, their design so refined that modern fishers in the Nile still copy their shape. And then science stepped in. DNA from modern Sudanese populations revealed the widespread of Y-DNA EM78, a marker of Afro-Asiatic-speaking pastoralists who roamed a lush Sahara during the African humid period, 12,000 to 5,000 years ago. These herders carried lactase persistence genes, allowing them to digest milk into adulthood. And Sudan today holds some of the most diverse lactase persistence variants in the world. This is not the genetic footprint of a civilization borrowing from Egypt. It's the signature of a civilization exporting its own advances. The shock comes here. Wheat and barley did indeed travel south from the Near East through Egypt, but sorghum, cattle culture, and possibly dairy genetics travelled north from Sudan into Egypt, reversing the long-held belief about who taught whom. In the Red Sea hills, ancient rock art still depicts sacred cattle, adorned for rituals, their owners genetically linked to today's Beja people, living descendants of those first herders. Their DNA bridges Sudan and the Horn of Africa, a human thread stretching thousands of years without breaking. Sudan wasn't the Nile's shadow. It was its source of life and innovation. And from these same riverbanks, from these same people, rose kings who would one day stride into Egypt, not as visitors, but as rulers. And from these riverbanks rose kings who would one day rule the land of the pharaohs. And from these riverbanks arose kings who would one day rule the land of the pharaohs. We know Egypt conquered Nubia, but what most don't realise is that Nubia conquered Egypt too. 2,000 years before the rise of the 25th dynasty, there was Kerma, a Sudanese kingdom thriving between 2500 and 1500 BC. Its capital rose on a bend in the Nile, its walls built of sun-dried brick, its palaces decorated with painted plaster. Kerma was not a shadow of Egypt. It was its equal, its rival. Egyptian records speak of fierce battles against Kerma's warriors, even as trade flowed between them, gold, ivory, incense, and bloodlines. Ancient DNA from Kerma's elite burials shows something unexpected. Sub-Saharan maternal lines intertwined with West Eurasian ones, proof that this was already a land where Africa and the outside world mixed. But the story turns in 747 BC, when Nubian power surged north. The Napatan kings crossed into Egypt, not as raiders, but as rulers. They became the 25th dynasty, the so-called Black Pharaohs, who wore the double crown and prayed to Amun in temples stretching from Napata to Thebes. In these years, Sudanese DNA entered Egypt's royal bloodline, shaping the genetics of the most famous civilization on Earth. And the Nile became a two-way river, not just for goods and armies, but for genes. Over millennia, modern Nubians came to cluster genetically with Egyptians, a living testament to centuries of shared history. They are still the people of the river, their blood carrying whispers of both empires. Picture it, a Nubian general, bronze-skinned, standing in the court of Thebes. His ancestors grazed cattle under the Sudanese sun, yet here he is, commanding the armies of Egypt, his voice echoing through the stone halls of Luxor. His lineage stretches across deserts and kingdoms, from the savannas of Sudan to the heart of the ancient world. But even as Nubia stood at the centre of power, trading and ruling alongside Egypt, there were others in Sudan who chose a different path. They turned away from foreign influence. They clung to something older, purer, and for centuries they remained untouched. But while Nubia mingled with empires, other people turned away from the world. In a land of mixing, one people remained untouched. They stood at the edge of history, watching the great kingdoms rise and fall, and yet their blood carried almost nothing from those encounters. Between 500 BC and 500 AD, the ancestors of the Dinka, Nuer and Shilluk moved steadily southward from central Sudan, leaving the Nile's political heartlands behind. They carved their lives into the Sud wetlands, a labyrinth of channels, papyrus islands, and floodplains so impenetrable that even armies dared not enter. Geography became their wall, a living fortress of water and grass. Their DNA is a time capsule. On the paternal side, Y DNA haplogroups A and B, among the oldest on Earth, dominate. On the maternal side, mtDNA L2 and L3 lines stretch back tens of thousands of years. And here's the remarkable part. There is virtually no Eurasian genetic input. Not from Egyptian traders, not from Arab migrations, not even from the massive movements that reshaped the rest of Sudan. In genetic terms, they are as close as we can get to seeing what Africa looked like before the waves of outside influence. But the Nilotes are more than their DNA. Their entire world revolves around cattle. Herds are wealth, status and dowry. Milk is life. Cattle songs, long rhythmic chants, are composed for prized bulls, their names etched into memory like family. They scar their skin in patterns that echo the horns of their herds, carrying beauty and identity on their own bodies. These customs have persisted for millennia, passed down under the open sky. For centuries their isolation worked. The empires came and went, but the Nilotes remained, a living firewall against the currents of change. But no wall holds forever. Beyond their wetlands, the desert was stirring. Caravans moved under a relentless sun, strangers tracing ancient trade paths, bringing with them goods, faiths, and new blood. But isolation would not last, because the desert was about to bring strangers. And here's the twist. The next great wave of change didn't come from the Nile. It came from the Sahara. For centuries, the Nilotic wetlands had been a world apart. But from the first millennium AD onward, the horizon to the west began to shimmer with movement. Hausa caravans, Fulani herders, and other merchants from the Sahel crossed into Darfur and Kordofan, their camels laden with salt, cloth, copper, and news from lands as far as the Atlantic coast. With them came new genes, including Y-DNA R 1B-V88, a paternal lineage tracing deep into West Africa, and the sickle cell gene, shaped by generations of life in malaria-rich environments. Some of these connections were built on trade, on shared markets and exchanged goods. Others were carved from human misery. The trans-Saharan slave trade moved in two directions. From Chad, Nigeria and beyond, enslaved men, women and children were brought into Sudan, their identities swallowed into new lineages. At the same time, Sudanese captives were marched north, sold into Egypt, Arabia, and even the far reaches of the Ottoman world. The genetic trail is still visible today. Among the Baggara Arabs, nomadic cattle herders of western Sudan, the sickle cell trait is unusually high, a silent testament to their West African ancestors, who carried the gene as a shield against malaria. These bloodlines were not chosen in love or alliance. They were forged through forced journeys under a burning sun, across dunes that seemed endless. Picture a caravan inching forward under the Saharan sky. The creak of leather saddles, the hiss of shifting sand, the silent eyes of those who knew they would never see their homeland again. Pilgrims headed east toward Mecca might walk beside captives bound for a life they could not imagine. Traders might count their profits under the same stars that watched over the dying in the sand. And yet, even with this wave of West African and Sahelian influence, Sudan's genetic story was far from finished, because the most profound transformation of all was about to arrive. It would not come on the back of camels or in chains. It would come with words, with faith, and with a tide that would wash through every corner of Sudanese life. But the greatest transformation in Sudan's DNA was still to come, carried on the tide of a new faith. But the greatest transformation in Sudan's DNA was still to come, carried on the tide of a new faith. And here's the part no one tells you. It wasn't war that Arabized Sudan, it was patience. In 652 AD, Arab forces clashed with the Christian kingdom of Makuria. The battle ended not with conquest, but with a document, the Baked Treaty. It was an agreement unlike anything else in medieval Africa. No further invasions, no forced conversions, only a pact of trade, peace, and time. For nearly 7 centuries, the Christian kings of Dongola held their ground, their cathedrals rising above the Nile, their crosses still gleaming in the sun. But patience has its own kind of power. In 1315 AD, Makuria collapsed, brought low by internal strife, famine, and waves of nomadic pressure. The walls of Dongola fell quiet, and through those silent gates came the tribes, not in armies, but in families, not with swords, but with marriages. The genetic record captures the moment like a fingerprint. Around 700 years ago, DNA dating shows a sudden, major admixture between Middle Eastern lineages and the peoples of Sudan. Arab men carrying Y-DNA-J1, markers from the Arabian Peninsula, married local women carrying mtDNA L0 through L3, some of the most ancient maternal lines on Earth. The result was a sex-biased genetic signature so distinct that it still defines Sudanese Arabs today. Imagine it. A caravan from the Hijaz, led by bearded traders in white robes, crossing the Red Sea and following the Nile inland. They settle in villages where the call to prayer slowly replaces church bells, where Arabic words begin to thread their way into Nubian songs. Over generations, the faith, the language, and the bloodlines fuse, until the memory of when the crescent first crossed the Nile is lost to all but the stones. And yet, once those gates had opened, they would never close again. The tide would not stop at a few families or a handful of tribes. It would grow, wave after wave, until the very map of Sudan's people was redrawn. And once the gates opened, the tribes kept coming. By the 17th century, Sudan wasn't one people, It was a tapestry, threads of desert caravans, river kingdoms, cattle camps, and holy roads knotting together in ways no scribe could fully record. In the heart of this weave stood a new power, the Funj Sultanate of Sennar, founded around 1504, ruling the Blue Nile country until 1821. Mosques rose beside markets. Nubian scribes, Arab jurists, and Blue Nile chieftains bargained under the same shade. The court at Sennar spoke the language of the Quran, counted taxes in grain and gold, and married across lines that older kingdoms once guarded. Nubian, Arab, Funj, a politics of blood as much as banners. Listen to the city at dusk. The call to prayer lifts over the river. Drums answer from the cattle camps outside the walls. A merchant from Dongola haggles with a trader from Suakin. Both know that the real value in Sennar is not just ivory, gum or slaves, it's status by alliance. Each marriage stitches another seam. Y DNA. J1 from Arabian forefathers enters some lineages. E1B1B and EV32 hold strong among the Beja and Blue Nile clans, while the older Nilotic A and B still pulse in bodies that never left the floodplains. North and East take in a Middle Eastern flavour, often 30 to 40% in parts, yet the South and West remain overwhelmingly sub-Saharan. Push west and the tapestry changes texture. In Darfur and Kordofan, the Baggara Arabs, Rizigat, Habaniya, Misriya, ride out between the 17th and 19th centuries. They are cattle people, desert people. They bring stories of the Hajj, new saints' tombs, new lineages. But only a small trace of Eurasian ancestry seeps into these lands. The Darfur Sultanate circa 1600 to 1916 governs a mosaic where African bloodlines remain dominant. Even today, the Fur and Masalit stand greater than 90% sub-Saharan in their genomes, proof that culture can shift while DNA holds the ground. You can see the past in the body. High sickle cell traits in Western nomads whisper of Sahel ancestors. Scant J, one among some clans, shows that Arab identity here was often adopted, not imposed by mass paternal replacement. Picture a dry season camp, Baggara boys singing to prize bulls, an imam's lantern swinging in warm wind, an old woman tracing clan names like prayer beads, each bead a marriage, a truce, a drought survived. This is where identity becomes layered. Faith on top of language, language on top of lineage. And still the old roots drink deep. But beneath these layers, scientists found something almost unbelievable. In the 21st century, when researchers cracked open the Sudanese genome, they weren't just tracing migrations or dynasties. They were staring into the deep past. And what they found were time capsules from humanity's dawn. Sudan, after millennia of invasions, trade and cultural fusion, still shelters genetic lines that predate every empire and every recorded history. Among the Nilotic peoples, the Dinka, Nur, Shilluk, the Y chromosome still carries haplogroup A, a paternal lineage that may go back over 200,000 years, to some of the very first men who walked this earth. On the maternal side, mitochondrial haplogroups. L0 through L, 3 survive in high frequency. The same maternal lines that left Africa tens of thousands of years ago to populate the globe. The science is staggering. Imagine testing the DNA of a Sudanese herder in the Sud wetlands and finding that his father line comes from an Arab ancestor who crossed the Red Sea 700 years ago. Yet his mother line, passed through unbroken generations of women, is as old as humanity itself. It's as if history itself left 2 signatures in one body, one from a medieval migration, another from the first sparks of our species. Every cell becomes a museum piece. Some genomes carry the footprints of pastoralist expansions, ancient back migrations, even Saharan climate shifts, while others preserve genetic markers that have barely changed since before the Nile carved its channel. In global studies, these ancient Sudanese lines act like anchors, helping scientists reconstruct the tree of human ancestry and measure the timelines of our spread. Without them, the map of humanity's past would have blank spaces. Picture it. Under a starlit Sudanese sky, a child sleeps in a cattle camp. She is unaware that her blood holds a story older than the pyramids, older than writing, older than any flag or border. Her DNA is both a bridge connecting Arabia, Africa, and the far reaches of the world, and a vault keeping the earliest chapters of our species locked safe inside her body. Final cliffhanger. And if one nation holds our shared human story, what other secrets lie hidden in its genes?